the agency of the student, questions around diversity, questions around equity, and of course, the key piece on the screen here today, disruption. And I do believe that disruption, I believe there's a battle of sorts. There is a power base shift that we should be mindful of in our consideration of the future of e-learning. And I'll actually speak about that term e-learning as well. I have some issues with that. But along the road of education, and contrary to this image, the road has been anything but a straight line. E-learning could be seen as one of the great disruptors. But in my presentation today, I explore how e-learning, this supposed disruptor, has itself been disrupted and will be increasingly disrupted, e-learning that is, into the future. You could say that the pandemic and other factors around the what was referred to as the persistent education model, this disruption in the disruption that technology was supposed to bring education has itself been disrupted. So we did talk about the disruption of education by technology. I'm also going to be speaking about the disruption of technology itself, calling into question the extent to which digital learning, digital education has actually shaken things up adequately versus secured and stabilized that which already existed. So I arrived from Sydney, Australia just yesterday, and we had an extraordinary 2 years down under. And I understand you went through a similar difficult time here, and indeed from the four corners from which you represented today. The future of e-learning, I believe, is going to be largely a function of how we respond to education today in times such as COVID. The pandemic shook the Australian education sector. In just 18 months, Australia's 27 billion euro education export sector shrunk by 34%. In Australia, prior to the pandemic, education grew to become the nation's third largest export industry, larger than agriculture, larger than much of the mining sector. Not a lot of people realize this. However, because hundreds of thousands of foreign students would inject billions of dollars into the Australian economy each year as they traveled to Australia to study. However, in 2020, the Australian government blocked entry to all people to Australia, including international students. And the impact you can see on the graph here. Through that experience, we learned that despite the Australian education system's prior deep investment in e-learning, the sector was largely unable to deliver a remote learning experience for international students who were trapped in their offshore countries through the pandemic. There were some winners, some institutions with native remote first e-learning offerings were able to provide continuity. But the graph shows that despite all the e-learning hype and rhetoric, the education sector in Australia lacked the agility and digital maturity to be able to continue to deliver courses and learning, more importantly, throughout that period. Universities are now rallying to address the e-learning failure, looking for improved remote and hybrid learning capabilities. E-learning is now being understood, and this is important, as an education model on its own, not necessarily as an add-on or some kind of adjunct to the real learning context. So seeing e-learning in its own way, as its own stand-up. And as you can see through the headlines here, through the pandemic, K-12 education in Australia was also shaken. National standardized testing, called NAPLAN tests in Australia, were cancelled in 22. How could that be? There's no standardized testing this year. Will the sky fall in? Interestingly, some high-stakes statewide standardized tests were also cancelled in last year in 2021 due to school closures due to COVID. But interestingly, the NAPLAN test results went online just before COVID. So we had a new online testing system before COVID. So you would think that would be okay, but that was not the case. That even though the tests were online, students were still required to physically be at school to sit the test online. And so here again, we see a maturity gap where e-learning is still understood as an extension of on-campus learning, unable to stand on its own. the benefits of remote access being held back for different reasons, often political, institutional. With the turmoil of student closures, lockdowns and uncertain exam arrangements, student well-being measures headlines. So then we started, and you probably in your countries saw this too, the issue of students' well-being being under strain. There were school closures, lockdowns. School authorities were limited in their ability to assist students with well-being issues. And this is important in terms of well-being data in K-12 education, is that all the student well-being data that was kept by jurisdictions was tied to student attendance at school. So the student was seen to be well if they were attending school regularly, if they didn't have behavioural incidents in the classroom. And those, of course, were often logged in systems. But with the pandemic, the students are all learning at home anyway through the lockdowns. And so that meant there was no well-being data at all, which actually raised the question of what do we really mean by student well-being data? Is it adequate to use expulsions and other institutional measures? Or is there a new breed of well-being data that's of more use for us? As an aside, the last headline here on the screen is quite telling. When NAPLAN testing resumed in 2021, after a year off, the state Victoria, with the longest period of school closures and lockdowns, they really had it hard down there in Victoria. They actually secured the top results of the national tests in the following year. And this is actually similar to an experience, I believe, some years ago with H1N1 swine flu in Hong Kong. Some studies there where schools who turned to remote learning because of the pandemic back then, also their students experiencing superior exam outcomes to previous years. That's interesting. As COVID disrupted education, many people started to question the need for NAPLAN tests and other state tests. We went without them for a couple of years. Do we really need them? Elements of the educational industrial establishment that were for so long seen as fixtures, as non-negotiables, were suddenly under threat, under question. Then the digital technologies that supported those fixtures also came into question. And so here you have the technology being disrupted as well as the education itself. And you see in the last headline here that some Australians started to question the way we understand and measure academic success and school quality. What does it mean to be outstanding academically? And they also called out the shortcomings of the existing wellbeing data, challenging bureaucratic measures of attendance, suspensions. And there was a call for a need for a new type of student wellbeing data, which I think is going to be something we will see in the future of e-learning. Finally, the pandemic accentuated underlying community inequality, the great resignation of teachers with the lockdowns. Less affluent households didn't have access to online learning. Children were unable to connect with their teachers or peers in homes that didn't have internet access, and there were many in Australia. Education departments scrambled to try to address the issue, some sending out tens of thousands of wireless dongles to households. But the success was patchy. Then we saw thousands of teachers actually leave the profession. In the headline here, more than 10,000 teachers leaving the profession in just one state alone. But some schools are now closed in Australia, not because of the pandemic, because of the subsequent teacher shortage. And so all this adversity and strain is actually putting more of a spotlight on the opportunity for e-learning to provide solutions, not to old system learning, but perhaps to new ways of teaching and learning at scale. And so this slide is really a summary of the previous headlines and what I've said. The Australian story, I suspect that this experience it resonates with some of you in your countries of origin. We can summarize the disruptions on the left, which I've mentioned, and on the right-hand side, see opportunities, significant opportunities that will disrupt the future of e-learning, and opportunities which I will focus on for the remainder of this presentation. So hopefully I've sort of set the scene a little bit. Through the COVID experience, digital innovation did not stand still. I've in my role across EdTech Association, I've seen startups just push on harder and harder through COVID. But perhaps our terminology has not stood still either. Let me comment on the term e-learning by way of an analogy. Back in 1865, Britain passed the Red Flag Act, formerly the Locomotive Act. The law restricted the use of newly invented motor cars. I hope you see the parallels here. Under the law, a vehicle could only travel on the road if a man walked or ran in front of the vehicle holding a flag. And this, of course, undermined the very purpose of having a car. The act was, at the time, I can provide the quote in my paper, an effective way to protect the pre-existing investments in horses, carriages, and trains. And so I ask, could that sort of Red Flag Act be at play in education? Is e-learning the new vehicle, encumbered by expectations designed to protect established education? I question the very term e-learning, even though I'm speaking on it today. Do we really need the E in front of e-learning? After 25 years of the World Wide Web, shouldn't we drop the E in front of e-learning? It's simply learning. Could it be that the sooner we drop the E from our vocabulary, from our thinking, the sooner we embrace digitization as a consolidated part of the learning experience, part of the redefinition of enhancement of learning, not as an adjunct, as I said before, or some sort of add-on, some sort of plug-in to learning. And so the pandemic has highlighted many deficits in student agency, deficits in students' capacity to direct their own learning. Many students were not used to playing the role of directing their own learning at home during the pandemic. Suddenly, with school closures, students were being asked to churn out project-based learning assignments. Students would have to work on these things more independently from home. The old practice of asking students to turn to page 8, answer questions 1 to 5 did not work for many students who are isolated at home, looking for that dongle to arrive in the post. Many digital learning environments are designed to mimic existing dominant direct instructional pedagogy. And whilst that pedagogy has an important role, the future of e-learning or learning, I believe, will be marked by a steady shift to increased focus on tools that promote student agency, or as we refer to as pedagogy, that is self-directed learning, moving beyond the education of children, the filling of empty vessels, to providing students those metacognitive capacities to direct their own learning, which I think harks on the earlier comments to the guide on the side, the sage on the stage, and all of that. So let's look at some digital innovations that speak to this future of e-learning to which I allude. Here we see an actual web conferencing platform. It is called Rev. It's currently being tested with a school municipality in Germany. And I look forward to visiting the stakeholders there in Germany in a few weeks' time. But the Rev platform, it was in a way a response to the COVID experience of children learning from home, and adults too. What it does, it allows for individual learning support while the entire class is in a common session. So Rev was designed to enable students to work quietly, applying their learning during the sessions, not just sitting and listening to the teacher talk or having a discussion. Suddenly, the teacher and support teachers in the class and the students could all be visible to one another as we are here, but the teacher or the teacher support could select any student in the session and have a one-on-one conversation without going off. It's almost as if the teacher was able to work through the room and have a discussion with each student, which then presupposes the idea that web conferencing sessions could be longer because the students could stay with the class all day. The teacher could be there. The teacher doesn't have to perform all day. The teacher doesn't have to be like the gentleman in the wood carving. The students can actually become more active, and yes, they can ping the teacher too. And so there could be much more. It's a conundrum. Is that passive sort of web conferencing environment becomes the more active learning experience? And here we see there's a student, I think, who has a couple of students who have a question. I can go and talk to Hannah or Max as the teacher. And then we have what we call this is a new development, I've had some involvement with in Australia and here in Europe around this concept called video virtualization. And from the screenshot, you get a sense the video is being played, but this is not a real video. It's virtualized. This professor is speaking on the topic of imperialism, but this is not a video of a single lecture on the topic. It is a virtualized video assembly comprised of 9 different segments from 9 different lectures by potentially different lecturers at different times, which have been virtually stitched together to present coherent video for this student. And the only reason this video exists is because the student went into this platform called Linnaeus and actually searched on imperialism and Mussolini, and it was able to immediately surface the virtualized composition. No additional file was created. It doesn't exist as an MP4. It's a URL, and it can be shared between educators and students, and they can create their own variants, their own derivative assemblies. And so this is where technology is being used to take students from being consumers of video, consumers of lectures, to conductors of video segments, being able to conduct and repurpose and actually share and annotate their story and their learning, almost a blogging response to video. And then this one, I think, is probably the cutest of all, an exceptional example in relation to student well-being, which I touched on earlier. I spoke about the problem of traditional student well-being data, but here we have a future-looking, what I believe is a future-looking well-being environment for younger learners. The platform is called Life Skills Go. It became very popular across Australia and New Zealand during the pandemic. In the Go platform, students check in each day for 1 or 2 minutes to reflect on how they're feeling. As they develop the habit of reflecting on their feelings, they learn more feelings. It proposes more feelings, and the teacher is able to then engage immediately data about the class's readiness for learning. They're here, but are they really here? The platform also provides videos, cognitive behavioral therapy videos, which respond and help the students through therapy on particular emotions they're experiencing from day to day. And there is a simple ability for the teacher to see the improvement that those therapies are having for the students' well-being, and they improve. Anecdotally, there are schools are claiming significant improvements in attendance and school outcomes. And I guess the Go program is an example of traditional e-learning itself being disrupted with a whole new data set, such as learning readiness becoming more valuable to schools in terms of understanding well-being than the old data of how many days a student was off, or whether they got caught doing whatever behind the shed, and so on. And finally, workplace learning, a project I've been involved with in Australia called Tipsy, which services the adult education hospitality training sector. Here in Europe, it's particularly pertinent because the major stakeholder backing this project is EHL, which is the world's premier hospitality school in Switzerland, and who saw that the future of, as a traditional hospitality school, saw an investment in online delivery of skills, hospitality skills, through this platform, where young people who come out of the education system want to develop skills in hospitality, hotel management, making a coffee, service sector, security, all those things, customer service, are now learning and accessing those courses online. And employers who are installing this platform to train their thousands and thousands of workers across Accor and some of the large hotel chains. And so this future for this particular platform is very much looking at micro-credentialing and building employment marketplaces, being able to more remove the mediation between those who seek those skills as important skills and those who are developing those skills. And so by way of conclusion, I believe the future of e-learning is bright, because I believe we will eventually drop the E, and because there will be disruption of e-learning itself, and that the world, as it goes through significant change, where critical thinking, inclusive initiative and problem-solving skills become increasingly important, then this will set the pressure. The market, to some extent, and policy needs to put pressure on allowing the learning to get on with the students' agency, the students' capacity to develop learning experiences for themselves being elevated. And I hope these experiences resonate with you today. Follow on from Sergio's great presentation, and look forward to speaking to you more about this during the conference. Thank you.